These are images you've probably never seen before. It's an atomic bomb detonating in the heart of the Australian outback. We're used to hearing about nuclear testing in the United States, but many Aussies don't realise that our own country was a testing ground too, and the price Australia paid for this was steep, with devastating impacts on our people and environment. And to make matters worse, Australia never got to share in any of the benefits from these tests. It was the British using Australia to test its bombs. They claimed to have cleaned up the site before handing it back to Australia, with a report saying it was now safe. But in 1984, more than 20 years after the test program ended, Australian scientists walked the land with Geiger counters to check for radiation and got the shock of their lives. Expecting to find low levels of contamination, they wore shorts and no protective clothing, but instead their readings fluctuated wildly. As they stumbled over rocks and soil, they realised they were treading on plutonium-soaked earth. They even found chunks of the deadly substance itself. Plutonium, a man-made element, is created in a nuclear reactor by bombarding uranium with neutrons. The isotope in question here is plutonium-239, which has a half-life of over 24,000 years, so remains dangerous practically forever. Inhaling just 20 milligrams of plutonium can cause a fatal illness. The scientists were there to survey the land before it was to be handed back to the traditional owners, the Maralinga Tjarutja people, who were displaced in their hundreds by the tests. The Australians were shocked and unprepared for what they found. The British had claimed to have cleaned up any contamination, and a report put together by UK scientist Noah Pearce made no mention of these deadly plutonium fragments. It's enough radioactive material that international laws would require it to be safeguarded from bad actors trying to make a bomb. It also contains secret traces of how the British bombs were put together, but was just left lying out in the desert, unguarded and undisclosed for decades. In the 50s and 60s, the British detonated 12 major atomic bombs and performed hundreds of related experiments across Australia, leaving many areas permanently contaminated with deadly radiation. It's a story of harm and negligence that starts with a few physicists and a seemingly worthless heavy metal, uranium. It's the heaviest of all natural elements and was known to have more neutrons than protons in its nucleus. Bombarding the nucleus with neutrons at high speed could cause it to split, undergoing nuclear fission. In 1938, researchers in Paris discovered that the uranium atom flings out extra neutrons when split. No one initially thought those neutrons could be harnessed or controlled for anything, but soon theories of a chain reaction made a bomb possible. Niels Bohr and John Wheeler published a memo on the fission process just 3 days before war broke out, putting everyone on the same starting line. Uranium-235 could easily sustain a chain reaction where the neutrons flung out by one nuclei splitting would go off and cause other nuclei to split, each time releasing a great deal of energy. A material reaches critical mass when more neutrons can go off and split other nuclei than are lost in the reaction. Otto Frisch and Rudolf Peierls, working in England, found that just a few pounds of uranium-235 were needed to reach critical mass. The British secretly worked on this idea under a deliberately boring-sounding name, the tube alloys. The British were well in front of the Americans at this stage, and in 1941, British research was given to the US, where it fueled the Manhattan Project that culminated in the dropping of bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. After this, the US didn't need the British anymore, and after a couple of high-profile atomic spies were discovered, they didn't trust the UK to keep secrets. UK physicists were shut out, and the Atomic Energy Act was introduced by the US in 1946 that banned collaboration on nuclear weapons development. It took the British by surprise, and this betrayal was why Britain turned to developing their own bombs and ended up coming to Australia to test them. Australia had their own reasons for allowing them to. One, Australia wanted to maximise the value of its extensive uranium resources. 2, they thought that helping the British might protect them in case of a nuclear war. And 3, they wanted to learn from the British in case they ever decided to make their own nuclear weapons or energy. But the British provided no nuclear secrets to Australia, and Australia was reluctant to ask. Australia was an ideal location for the British tests. There were vast areas of land, we had a Prime Minister who said yes without asking too many questions, and, well, it wasn't Britain, and any harm would be out of sight and out of mind for them. The British arrived in Australia in 1952 and tested their first atomic bomb at the Montebello Islands. They were keen to test the effects of detonating a weapon in the hold of a ship and analysing the specifics of a phenomenon called base surge, which involved a large upward movement of radioactive water.
The weapon was 25 kilotons, which is 10 kilotons more than the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. So it was a very powerful weapon. It was one of the most powerful, not the, but one of the most powerful bombs detonated in Australia. It did spread fallout over a wide area. That is still actually being investigated scientifically. I do know from my own research that the fallout went as far as Brisbane. So it was tracked across the continent.
For the next tests, the British moved to Emu Field in the Australian desert. There, Operation Totem detonated more bombs, this time testing the impact of differing proportions of plutonium. They left a kilometre-wide patch where the Earth was heated to such high temperatures that it became glass.
Totem 1, which was detonated on the 15th of October of 1953, created a very mysterious phenomenon that later became known as the black mist. We still don't fully understand what the black mist was. We do know that it travelled about 170 kilometres to the northeast of the Emu Field site, where it rolled over largely Indigenous populations around the settlements of Wallatina and Granite Downs, that kind of area. We know that it was a very strange phenomenon, a greasy black cloud that had a strange smell. Some people said it smelt like kerosene, other people said it smelt like a dead kangaroo, and it stuck to everything. And very soon after the black mist rolled over those communities, people started to get very ill, and some people died, some people had chronic illnesses, some people reported eye problems and indeed blindness.
Next, Britain's focus shifted to testing a hydrogen bomb before an international treaty to limit nuclear weapons testing took effect. Since hydrogen bombs are even more powerful than atomic ones, Australia did actually put its foot down and said no to testing them. So instead, the British just tested a device that could operate as a fission trigger for one, and this remains the biggest atomic device ever to explode in Australia. It was tested back at the Montebello Islands in June 1956. Its cloud rose 14,000 metres high, so different from what authorities had predicted that many people thought something had gone terribly wrong. Back in the desert in 1956-57, this time at a more permanent base at Maralinga, 7 more atomic bombs were detonated as part of Operations Buffalo and Antler. These were detonated in a few ways, from steel towers, dropped from aircraft, or from tethered balloons 300 metres high. There was also Buffalo 2, detonated at ground level, that created a 21-metre deep bomb crater. Damage from these tests spread over a large part of the continent, but the worst was still to come. The most dangerous scientific experiments in Australia's history were the Vixen B series of so-called minor trials conducted between 1959 and 1963.
The minor trials, and that name is rather ironic, and it's kind of deliberate as well. It was intended to be misleading. They were extremely dangerous and extremely damaging. The Vixen B trial involved using conventional explosives to detonate a lump of plutonium. This is a test to see what would happen if an aircraft carrying an atomic weapon crashed or caught fire, or there was some accident, or even terrorism. There were 12 Vixen B tests altogether, and in one of those we know for sure a chain reaction did eventuate. So that is, it was a small atomic weapon. The rest of them were more like what would be known today as dirty bombs, suitcase bombs. They just spread the radioactive material in a plume shape across the landscape. Essentially, Vixen B left more than 20 kilograms of plutonium-239 at the site without any safeguards. And that had implications later for international agreements that Australia was party to, but also just for anyone who happened to enter that territory. They were at risk of exposure to highly dangerous material.
Secrecy and cover-ups meant the British nuclear tests in Australia remained mysterious for decades, until a Royal Commission presented the findings of its investigations in 1985. Australia really had no idea what had gone on. The tests massively disrupted and harmed the Aboriginal people, who didn't have the federal vote and were not counted in the census until 1967. In Maralinga, people spotted living on the land were directed to a station at Yalata. Still, small groups did walk across the grounds after the tests began.
The Native Patrol Officer, William McDougall, and his officer, Bob McCauley, they had the task of keeping Aboriginal people away from the site, and that was an impossible task given the size of the territory and the routes between waterholes and people visiting family. You know, it was a busy place and people were traversing the territory all the time. One particularly famous example of that happening during the tests was the Milpuddy family. They walked onto the Maralinga Range in 1957, several months after a test had been held at a site called Marku, the only bomb test at Maralinga that involved detonating a device on the ground, and so it created a crater, a very deep and wide crater. The Milpuddy family camped by the side of that crater. They weren't found until a patrol the next morning, and they were hastily taken away. It was the father, mother and children and some dogs, and they were rather brutally showered and had Geiger counters run over them. On the orders of Minister for Supply, Howard Beale, their dogs were shot in front of them. Edie Milpuddy, the wife, was pregnant at the time and she lost her baby soon after. There were plenty of other instances where people were treated just as harshly, placed onto trucks, taken away to places on the Great Australian Bight, to missions and places like that, losing contact with their land. And so the Milpuddy story is an important one on a human level, to understand what happened to real people who were displaced and mistreated by the British trials.
The British did not accurately describe what they were leaving behind. Low-rank military personnel put together the data in the Pierce report, and their measurements lacked an understanding of how radiation could be dispersed. That was strange, since understanding the dispersal of radiation and its consequences on the environment was an important part of what the British were hoping to gain from the tests in the first place. The British cleanup was inadequate. They churned up the topsoil using a tractor instead of removing all the plutonium. The Royal Commission said that Maralinga is probably the only place in the Western world where plutonium is dispersed without precise knowledge of how much is above and below ground. Another cleanup of Maralinga was organised by Australia in the mid-1990s and involved sealing material into concrete pits.
There's still quite a bit of controversy about whether or not that was adequate. However, I'm satisfied that the site is much safer than it was before the clean-up. So there are still limits on visiting there. There are time limits on how long you can spend on the site, and no one can stay there indefinitely in the forward range part of the Maralinga Range. The half-life of plutonium-239 is 24,400 years, so you don't get rid of it on human timescales anyway. So yes, it's no one will ever be able to inhabit those places.
The state that Emu Field and Montebello were left in by the British was not much better. and today there are still signs warning tourists not to stay longer than an hour. Australia fronted many of the running costs and gave political backing and military personnel, but was never in charge or privy to the information gained. The media was muzzled by strict government censorship, and the public was kept in the dark about the potential dangers of radioactive fallout. Military personnel involved in the tests were exposed to dangerous levels of radiation, and many have suffered severe health consequences. Indigenous communities living near where the test took place were not consulted or informed of the dangers they faced, and many were forced to abandon their ancestral lands and relocate to other areas.
I think we all, as Australians, have an obligation to make sure that this never happens again. I think it's a very, very dark era in Australian history, and we need to guard against government secrecy and under-the-table agreements between Australia and the so-called great powers.
Despite the passage of time, the true extent of the damage caused by the tests remains unknown. The legacy of the nuclear tests in Australia is a chilling reminder of the dangerous power physics has given us and the lasting consequences of our actions. This video covered a serious topic, and if you're looking for something a little more lighthearted to watch next, I'd like to tell you about a new video series that I'm involved with. Earlier this year, I travelled across New Zealand with some friends as part of a competitive game-based reality show called Jet Lag. It was a fun and stressful way to see the country, and it was a chance for me to show off a different side of my personality since we filmed it in a relaxed vlog-style format. Jet Lag is a Nebula-first show, meaning that it is always one episode ahead on Nebula compared to YouTube. But what is Nebula? Well, it is a creator-owned streaming service that I just joined, and it allows YouTubers to create cool and ambitious content that they wouldn't be able to make otherwise. Buying a Nebula subscription is a way to support me directly and a bunch of other creators. They have originals such as Up and Adams' Is Math Invented or Discovered, and they have a new feature called Nebula Classes, teaching a range of topics related to content creation. If you sign up using my link below, you support me directly and get access to Nebula and Nebula Classes for around $2.50 per month or $30 USD per year. Using my link gives 40% off the annual plan. If you join Nebula, you can also listen to the exclusive podcast, The Layover, which I'm on with the guys from Jet Lag, talking all about the decisions that we made on the show and what happened behind the scenes. Thanks for watching this video, and thanks to my Patreon supporters, including today's Patreon Cat of the Day, Jan.